Hey everyone, I'm Shaylin here with Reedsy. Today we're going to be talking about character versus plot-driven narratives. The difference between plot versus character-driven stories or narratives comes up quite a lot. Sometimes there's discussion over which type is best, sometimes it's just the difference between the two. And the truth is that most books will lean into qualities of both. Recently we did a video on upmarket fiction where we talked about the difference between literary and commercial genres, and in the past the distinction has been drawn that commercial or genre fiction is plot-driven, whereas literary or upmarket fiction is character-driven. And although this does have some truth to it, you will probably find more plot-driven narratives in commercial fiction and more character-driven narratives in literary fiction. The distinction really isn't that clean. This may have been more true in the past, but commercial fiction has become increasingly character-driven. There's certainly still plot-driven books out there, but genre fiction is definitely becoming more and more character-driven. So the distinction that commercial fiction is plot-driven and literary fiction is character-driven just doesn't really hold up anymore. So in this video, we're going to be talking about the difference between a character and a plot-driven narrative. What are the qualities of each? The initial difference is pretty self-explanatory. It comes down to what the primary fuel of the story is. A plot-driven narrative is going to rely more on its exciting storyline and plot. It's going to be action-driven, and the narrative fuel is going to come from the plot. A character-driven story plot is there to support the character development, but the character development is really what readers are here for. Of course, you don't want it to feel like one of these elements is necessarily serving the other. You don't want it to feel like the plot is just there to serve the characters or vice versa. But plot or character is going to be the driving force in the narrative, depending on which type of narrative you're writing. Now that all seems pretty self-explanatory. Okay, plot-driven narratives rely more on plot, character-driven narratives rely more on character. You don't really need me to tell you that. It's in the name. So let's look at the difference between plot-driven and character-driven narratives based on different components of the story. So let's start by looking at character. How is character going to work differently in a plot-driven narrative versus a character-driven narrative? Of course, in a character-driven narrative, the character is the focus. This is really why we're reading. The character development is the core fuel of the story. Character-driven narratives often feature messier characters. Their internal conflict is the center of the story. They don't have necessarily clear-cut strengths versus flaws, or good versus bad qualities. A really easy way to know if your story is character-driven or plot-driven is ask yourself, if the protagonist were any other character or any other person, would the story unfold the same way? If the answer is no, then it's probably a character-driven narrative because the story relies on this specific person being the protagonist. Character change is essential in a character-driven narrative. It's very rare that you're going to read a character-driven story and find a static character in the place of protagonist. On the other hand, plot-driven narratives often feature characters with more clear-cut flaws and strengths, qualities that more easily fit into the plot development. Their strengths and flaws will be in a push and pull between helping them and impeding them from achieving their goal. Unlike in a more character-driven work, where the character's personality can just be overall too messy, in a plot-driven narrative, the protagonist is our vehicle to exploring the plot. Usually we will see character development, we will see character change, but in some plot-driven narratives you will see static characters. It's definitely not the norm, but it is possible, whereas in a character-driven narrative, character change really is crucial. In a plot-driven narrative, it's more likely that you'd be able to swap out the protagonist and have the plot unfold in basically the same way. It doesn't mean you could necessarily put anyone on Earth in that role, especially if the plot relies on the protagonist's specific skill set. But the character's internal conflict isn't really what's driving the plot line. Now, both plot-driven and character-driven narratives rely on character choice. Choice is so important. Having active characters is so important, no matter what style of narrative you're writing. But in a plot-driven narrative, the story will focus more on the choice and its consequences for the plot, and in a character-driven narrative, the story will focus more on why that choice was made. Now let's talk about some differences in plot. In a character-driven narrative, the plot is heavily based on the protagonist's internal struggle and their decision-making. In many ways, the plot is just the path that we need to take to fully understand this character. Internal conflict is the focus. There still is external conflict, but it's there to showcase the internal conflict. You also might have less of a clear endpoint. Even though the character should have goals and there should be a direction, there might not be a clear destination that's known from the beginning. On the flip side, plot-driven narratives typically have clear endpoints that they're working towards. A clear antagonistic force or enemy that needs to be defeated, a destination that needs to be reached, a clear problem that needs to be solved. The external conflict is the focus here, but it does in turn cause some internal conflict so we can still have rich and interesting characters. Plot-driven narratives really do rely on interesting, gripping, sometimes twisty plots, with a clear escalation of stakes, problems, and conflicts that eventually lead to the story's conclusion. And finally, let's look at the difference in theme. In a character-driven novel, theme is explored through the character's flaws and choices. There usually isn't a clear moral. It's more of an explanation of an idea, and that idea is really rooted in the character's internal conflict. On the flip side, in a plot-driven narrative, theme is explored through the chain of events. You can think of the plotline as proving the story's theme. So if the story's theme is related to good versus evil, a very classic theme that you see in a lot of kind of classic fantasy books, the story's plotline would show good triumphing over evil in the end, so the plotline is what proves the theme to us. There may actually be kind of a moral or a lesson involved, whereas character-driven novels typically don't have that. The theme also is probably a lot clearer. People often think of literary fiction as being very heavy on theme, but actually, maybe counterintuitively, theme is often a lot murkier, messier, and harder to define in a literary fiction book or in a character-driven book than in a plot-driven book. There's more of a neatness to how theme is handled in a plot-driven novel. It allows the book to have a clear message. This becomes a lot more difficult in a character-driven novel because people can just be too messy to have such a clear-cut philosophy or thesis to a novel. In the end though, most books will take qualities from both. Even though we might class some books as character-driven and some books as plot-driven, most books should have both interesting complex characters and interesting gripping plot lines. It's very rarely an all or nothing kind of thing. This doesn't mean your book has to be 50-50, both character-driven and plot-driven, but it's very, very rare that you're going to see a book that's completely plot-driven or completely character-driven. Your book probably does lean one way or the other, and that's totally fine, but you can always learn from the other style of narrative. The best character-driven novels understand how to use plot effectively, and the best plot-driven novels still have rich and interesting characters. So that's the difference between plot and character-driven narratives. Which type of narrative do you tend to write or prefer? Let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos from us. We've got new writing, editing, and publishing tips every Tuesday and Friday. Until next time.